Hello and welcome to Culture Snaps. I'm Keeva Stratton, and on this special episode we have two extraordinary women and champions of inclusive media representation who just happen to be sisters, Emma and Lucy Race. 5 years ago they launched Making the Call, a media pathway program designed to help female and non-binary commentators gain vital opportunities in sports media. Both successful broadcasters in their own right, and two of the hosts of the popular Outer Sanctum podcast, they see it as their purpose and mission to break down barriers for women and non-binary people in our very male-dominated sports media landscape. I hope you enjoy. Lucy and Emma Race, welcome to Culture Snap.
Hi, so nice to see you.
We're so excited to have you because, first of all, obviously, we're all Hawthorn supporters here, which immediately tells me that we're highly intelligent people with great taste.
Well, it's true. It's always nice to hang out with other Hawthorn people because we don't, get labelled smug when we're together, at least, but it might be unbearable for the listeners if we dug in too deep about all the premierships and how excited we are about the upcoming AFLW season and how we are very, very bullish about what we think the women can do on the field. But it's so nice to see you, Keeva, and we always come away from conversations with you so inspired that it's almost like a hot air balloon takes off in my heart when I've spoken to you. So I can only assume that today this is going to go next level and we'll end up in fits of giggles and shrieks of inspiration.
I'm very excited to have you here, and I'm hoping we could talk a little bit about Making the Call. Perhaps we can start with what is Making the Call, because I'm sure there are some people that haven't heard of it.
Making the Call is a venture that Emma and I started back in 2020. We were watching football and watching all of the sports that we loved and getting frustrated that there wasn't the diversity that we were seeing on field and in the stands, in the commentary box. And so Making the Call is a program, a series of programs. It's an organisation that its main goal is to increase the number of women and gender diverse people in sports media in Australia. And Emma and I have been working on that for 5 years. It's a creative response. It's a disruptive response. And we're proud to sit here today and know that we've got over 150 people that have gone through our programs who are now, we can hear them, we can read their opinion pieces, we can read their match reports. They are making real difference in sports media in this country.
Fantastic. And to give our listeners just a bit of context, because while we assume everyone listening is from Australia, we do have a few people from overseas listening as well. So we're talking specifically about female commentary in sport in Australia, which, unlike many countries around the world, is very lacking. You can literally watch entire sports programs without seeing one female commentator. And often when you do, they're assigned to these kind of very small roles. So they might be what we call a boundary rider. So that's someone who sits on the boundary of an Australian football rules match and just provides short comments. It's unlike other areas of the world. There really is such a low representation. So 150 people, they've gone through over the course of 5 years. And what kind of results are you getting for these women?
It's been unbelievable, the response, and it's not just because of the course, it's because of the time, it's because of demand, it's because sports are looking to diversify. We've seen the rise of W sports just go through the roof. Australia's national teams are probably the most revered in the women's space. We're looking at the Australian women's cricket team, the Matildas, our basketballers just won World Cup. And then, of course, we've got AFLW, which is the only professional contact sport for women in the world at the moment. And so they get paid as professional athletes. But not only that, like you look at our Olympics teams, the women's swimming team has always far exceeded the men's, and we have on track as well. So we've got really great, we've got great stories and women and the aspect of women succeeding in sport in this country is a part of our national identity. But the thing that we always felt was lacking is like every time we look at Cathy Freeman winning the 400 at the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, it's amazing and people revere her run, but they also revere the call that was done by either Tim Lane or Bruce McAvaney. Now, I guess at its absolute core, Lucy and I think about that and we go, imagine if that had been called by a First Nations woman. Like the impact and the storytelling behind that would have sat behind that in that moment would have really elevated the storytelling to another level. And so I guess what we're looking at is the opportunity that we have to make sure that the people on the field are being represented with the storytelling behind the scenes, whatever that looks like. And we're really grateful that industry has come along for the ride with us. They understand that in this very thirsty market of globalized sport where people can watch anything they want to watch at any time, that they have to have a competitive edge. And you're so right about overseas. I look at the States and I think about the roles that women have held in sports broadcasting in the States. They have been revered for quite a long time. They still do have more men calling men's games and probably women's games at the moment as well. But I kind of look to people like Oprah or Ellen DeGeneres, people who over the journey have actually been able to hold the title of the biggest celebrity on TV or the biggest voice on TV. And here in Australia, we've just never had that. There's never been women who have ruled the landscape in any kind of form of media, really. And we know that culturally that there's an issue with that. We understand, we've lived that. And the reason why we were so acutely aware of this issue was because we were broadcasters at the time that we kind of realised this was happening. And so I think that the impetus falls on everyone, and thankfully people have been picking up the mantle, and as a result of that we've got people who've done our course who are now, they've got bylines at the major newspapers, they're hosting Friday night footy, they're calling games, they're calling all sorts of different sports. We've had a handful that went to the Olympics as producers and also as commentators. We've got people who are working on sports that I'd never even heard of before we started this initiative, like underwater hockey, things like that we didn't even know existed. We've got people who are calling ice hockey in Australia, which is actually a really big deal because ice hockey is not massive in Australia. And we've got a really diverse set and cohort of people. So we've got people who are from disability sports, First Nations people, we've got women, gender diverse people, and we just feel really proud of what they're all achieving because they're all pushing, and it's not easy. Social media makes it incredibly dangerous at times for them. But as a cohort, the 150 of them are really pushing this story forward. We just do everything we can to support them.
It's an interesting observation, isn't it, that we kind of punch above our weight as a nation in sport. We're a nation of a mere 26 million people, and yet I think on the global stage we're always, in the major sports, quite up there. I see this trend kind of at a bit of a macro level in Australia as well, where, perhaps more marginalised or underrepresented groups in society tend to overrepresent in sport. So it's quite a gateway for many communities to rise up in society and to really, kind of capture the success of sport in Australia. We see that, of course, with our First Nations people. Compared to population, they are much higher represented across our various sporting codes. I think it's really interesting that you yourselves are taking on a similar battle that really is of its own creation. There's no reason from a population standpoint, from an achievement standpoint, or from a human interest standpoint that women's sport in Australia should be kind of relegated to a second place, and or that female sports presenters or commentators should find themselves so marginalised. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges facing women today if that's the career they wish to pursue?
I think one of the challenges is that in terms of the media landscape, particularly in commercial media in Australia, that we always do what we've always done. So seeing change can take a really long time. Sport's a really interesting category, I think, to talk about issues of equity, because sport occupies a place in the conversation in Australia that is really, really prioritised. Like, it's right up at the top, and it can be a way. I often think of it, and we talked about this when we had our podcast, we talk about sport being a bit of a Trojan horse, that it's a conversation that you can kind of have with lots of people, but you can talk about really serious issues through that prism. And I think in terms of change being slow, there are a lot of commercial considerations that come into it in terms of the media landscape becoming harder and harder. the rise of streaming, the rise of podcasts, the fact that you can listen to so many things without actually having to pay anything, means that at some point there comes a crunch. That I think has made some people maybe more reluctant to take risks. But I also think that when you've got a national sport like Australian rules that has been played by men and is still very masculine in its culture, that it takes time to push against that and to change. So I think as time goes on and we see women's sports, particularly at that elite level, start to change the conversation, the hope is that it will have structural change. But the reality is, I think that any structural or systemic change or organisational change takes really intentional actions.
Can I jump in there? Because the other thing that I think sport plays this part in shaping our cultural identity, and we can't lose sight of the fact that nostalgia is a place that can make people feel on the weekends or whenever they're watching sport, the nostalgia of it and the family connection, or there's often people, they chest beat about how long they've been a member or their grandfather was a member, or, I remember going to this ground when, or whatever. So it hangs on to those leftovers really hard with both hands, because it's not just not being innovative. It's not just saying, well, this is how we do it and we won't ever change it. It's because the people who they believe to be, and that's the key part, it's the people that they believe to be funding it with their own dollars and cents, feel that nostalgic pull, and that's what makes them part with their money, become a member or whatever. So I think that we're at a real crux time, and we talk about how we're in a category of one doing this work at the moment, and I don't know how long that will last, but we're in a category of one because at the moment the response doesn't need to be bigger than it is yet, but it will change, and it will have to change, because the way that the consumer is taking on sport will change, because the way that we know through data and through research, the way that people younger than us, I should say, watch sport is completely and entirely different to the way that that we watch it, or that our parents watched it, or the generations ahead of us watched it. And so I also think in that the complete structure of it will have to change, because the viewing habits will determine that it has to.
And demand it. And I mean, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there is change happening, and there is positive change. And I think sometimes when you're working towards changing something in a big way, you can sometimes lose sight of the little wins. And there was a game here on the weekend where, and I'm saying it like this for our overseas listeners, but there was a men's football game on the weekend that was the greatest comeback in history. And one of the people in the commentary box for that game was Jess Webster, who was calling the game. And I have this little just burst of happiness and pride that just has been sitting in my chest since that moment, because Jess's voice is now going to be part of that call. So Jess, through the work that she's been doing and the support that she's had from the organisations that she works for, is now part of that nostalgia, I guess, because it's something that is going to get replayed, because it was a historic event. And those little moments really can help push forward, because it will change the expectations of listeners.
It changes the footprint of the memory for everyone who ever listens to it again. And for little girls and boys, but, for little girls listening out in the future, they'll hear that differently. They won't hear that the way that we always heard Bruce McAvaney calling the Kathy Freeman run. It might just ignite something in them that makes them think, well, this is a place for me too.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting when you look backwards and how shocking something is from a different generation's perspective. And as we've sat in this attention economy for a very long time, I think that sports are trying to figure out their place in that. I remember talking to a sporting body a few years ago, and they said, look, our competition isn't other sports anymore. It's other forms of entertainment. It's gaming. It's those, YouTube and things like that, younger people are taking their attention away from sport, viewership in particular. So I also think there's something really interesting in what Gen Z and Gen Alpha demands of people, employers, and, ultimately of their entertainment. They're expecting to see female voices. They're expecting to see diverse voices. And I think there is a disconnection between perhaps media owners and what the next generation is actually demanding. And that gap is their risk, because if they don't start to actually meet the demands of the next generation or the expectations, then they are going to look dated in the now, which is kind of a real risk for these organisations, because we know that's where the money is.
And especially because they do these media deals 7 years out, they sign on to things. We know we've had our business for 5 years, and the way that we had to deliver it in the first year is completely different to the way that we deliver it now. And the opportunities have completely changed for the graduates in that time. So when you think about how deft we have to be in responding to the changes in media, I cannot imagine the millstone of having a 7-year media contract around your neck and having to deliver under the same auspices as something that happened when you signed on 7 years ago. And it does look tired. It sounds tired to me. That's one of the other barriers, is that, we've always, the structure of sport, by virtue of the fact that only men used to play it and only men called it and commentated at the highest levels, it's always been created for a male audience. And that's how they see sport. That's how, we've all been conditioned to believe that sport has to be dished up. I simply do not believe that to be the only way. And so I'm a ridiculous creative who's always dreaming up new ways, but all I can think is that the next frontier is actually showing sport completely differently. And it's not that there's not an example of that. If you think about the Big Bash and what David Barham did for Channel 10 with the Big Bash, it was completely different. Think about World Series cricket and what Kerry Packer did for that, completely different. And it looked different. It looked different for maybe, a season, 2 seasons, and then all of a sudden it becomes the norm. So it can happen. We do have skin in the game to make sure that we're changing it. My fear is that at the moment there are no female heads, there's no women or gender diverse people leading any media organisations with those big sporting contracts. And so I think it's going to take a lot of consultation until one of us gets there, and maybe that will be one of our graduates, and that is the great hope, that we are giving people enough experience that they could be the next ones to take that job on.
Yeah, I think the Australian media landscape, particularly in the last 2 years, has gone through a bit of a cultural reckoning. There's been some very high-profile cases where gender inequity has been very much at the fore, and we know from the board level down, there's a much greater consciousness now as to be much more inclusionary and aware of the repercussions if you don't address these kind of cultural issues. It was interesting, I was reading a piece yesterday by Lola Bakare, who's an American marketer who has this incredible book called Responsible Marketing, and she felt that there was a desire for change in Australia, which I thought was really interesting, because I've often seen us as a bit behind, and perhaps that's what we needed, was something of a bit of a kind of legal reckoning for things to be a little bit more aware and conscious. I do think things can change very quickly, and your examples there show how, certainly my grandmother was a huge cricket fan, and she used to call it the pajama game, the one-day series. She hated it, and then by her death, she was watching women's cricket. So, you can change. You can certainly evolve very quickly. What do you think's the next frontier in Australian media? Do you think there's going to be, are we going to stick with traditional media? Is there going to be new forms of content production? What do you think is the next opportunity?
Oh, this is delicious as a concept. I would like to see it change swiftly, but I think the biggest thing that will change it will be media ownership. I think if we see like Meta, Amazon obviously already does own media platforms, but if we see them start to purchase sports franchises or be the ones that are doing the deals, I actually think that the traditional audience will shit themselves, because if you've got people from overseas deciding how long you can cover a game. I watch Red Zone a bit, which is the way that our household watches American football games, and that just basically switches between games. And I never really sit and watch a whole game unless it's the Super Bowl. And so, things like that. We might see something like that, and you hear the pushback when Channel 7 or free to air didn't have doesn't have a Saturday game, the pushback on that would be immense. But, you know, I think media ownership will be what changes it, what shakes it up, and it means that the platform will change. We'll be watching sport on our devices way more. I imagine it will be really short, sharp focuses. You can already see it in the minis. If you're looking online, looking at pay TV, you can always watch things in catch up and minis. I imagine that there would be a gaming element to it. I can only imagine that gambling will become an even bigger part of it. And I don't know how that sits with when you think about the intersection with W sports. A lot of them have really firm ideas about the players do, about the way that they want to, you know, the kinds of brands that they want to wear on their jerseys or on their dresses or whatever, on their kits, whatever it is. So I feel like we'll see a lot more high-end brands though coming in. The kinds of happy stories that I look to would be Arsenal FC and the work that Juliet Slott's been doing over there. I've seen heaps of really high-end brands come in. There's also been a lot of data-driven responses to who's going to the games and how they're pitching those games at their audience. They're really meeting the audience where they live, and they're also doing a really good job of being able to bring fans over from other codes and other clubs to follow Arsenal Women's. That's something that we haven't succeeded with here. And interestingly, I think that we are a really good place for people to try things out. I think a lot of brands do that anyway. You would know that better than us, Keeva, but I don't think that they often touch traditional settings. So I think that the AFLW, for example, would be a really good place to try things out. We know the AFL does that with the AFLW anyway, but I think that global brands should have a look at the AFLW and see what they might be able to achieve there. We know that there's a shortfall in what the W makes back because it's only in its 10th season. So it doesn't take ticketing on the door, which is a real challenge. But I think that, you know, the way that we look at global sports franchises and the way that they're converting fans, the way they're dishing up the offering has completely changed. And I think that I think that's the next frontier in terms of the creative response to the way that we talk about sport, the way we dissect sport, the way that we offer sport. I think there has to be multiple touch points to be able to convert those fans and to keep the old ones.
And if I just add something there, I think what we've seen in all forms of media and also entertainment is a real move towards flexibility, that people can watch what they want when they want to watch it. And so in terms of audience, I think audiences now expect that if you want to listen to a show or watch a show, you can do it when you want to watch it. And I think that is something that is going to really creep into sports media. And all I can think is that there's a real opportunity to have diverse voices calling that sport and talking about that sport that gives the audience the option to listen to someone different. And that technology we have now, so you can listen to a parochial call of a football game by football fans on radio stations. We've seen it on Fox football in the past, and we've seen it with some trials that, say, the AFL have done with children and with callers in different languages calling the games. And I wonder whether that is something that we might start to see going forward. I think in terms of audience, it's really interesting when you talk about women's sport and you talk about having more diverse voices in sport, that sometimes we tend to think about wanting to have women and gender diverse people calling women's sport. And I think we have to really push back at that and say, what I think is better for all of us in the long run is if we are really acknowledging that audiences for both men's and women's sports are really diverse, and we have a much better experience if we have different people in a commentary box, because people see things differently. So if we've got, 3 people sitting in a commentary box, or the same 3 journalists writing about a particular sport, and they've all come from a similar background and have similar life experiences, they're not going to pick up on the differences and the other aspects of stories that people with a different lived experience will have. So they're the things I think about.
I've got so much I want to pick up on there. When it comes to brands, I think it's such a blind spot for so many brands that they're not engaging more with women's sport, because when we think about the consumer, females still largely are the decision makers over our economic worth, and to not kind of take that opportunity to target them, I just think is crazy. I'm also really interested with the way that our content behaviours shape sports themselves. You know, we've talked about some examples there of how cricket went from a long game to a shorter game to a shorter game to a shorter game, which mirrors society's need for, you know, immediacy and quick content. And in our Australian football, there's been conversations lately about the length of the game. This is, you know, something to its detriment. Now, currently it's being framed as the length of the game for the players, but a cynical mind might suggest that this is actually more about viewership and ensuring that content doesn't extend past that which we can sit through as a generation that is much more used to immediacy and short content. How do we kind of get the experience of women's sport into the mainstream? Because I think if you go and experience it, you would just go every opportunity you could. It's social, it's fun, it's all ages, and you know, you have a great time no matter what the score is at the end of the day. How do we sell that to the world?
I think it's a really big question, Keeva, and I'm not sure that we can solve it easily, because I think of what we're seeing, and don't get me wrong, like men's AFL games have always had that underlying aggression and violence, and I am still very affected by something that happened when, you know, I was under 10 and there was an incident outside a football game. A young father died. And so I've always kind of had that in my football kind of historical sort of feelings about it. And I think if I think about going to men's football over the years, there's often been that sort of sense of, I've had a sense of fear, or I've felt like there's this simmering kind of aggression that could explode into something. And so I think that the thing that worries me now is that when you look broadly, so you zoom out from sport and you see some of the other issues that we're finding, particularly for young men and boys, and what that means for everybody else, where people are feeling more isolated and then basically, you know, maybe kind of go down that aggressive route as a way to feel better or to feel like they are part of something else if they're trying to find belonging. And if that belonging has come from like an Andrew Tate or some of the things that they're seeing online, there's that. I sort of worry about what's happening there. And also I think gambling and alcohol are also these other factors that do come into sport. And I haven't necessarily seen, you know, the data on it, but when people talk about abuse that's happening of players post-game and a lot of racial abuse, there is a lot of discussion about the impact of betting and gambling culture on those kinds of expressions that are violent and aggressive. So I think that the challenge, particularly in those really big sort of sports and those big crowds, is that you're fighting against something that's not necessarily just limited to sport, that there's other cultural influences coming in there. And so I don't know that we can necessarily take some of the things from W sport and bring them into men's sport. What I don't want to see happen is for W sport to go the same way. So what I think we really need to prioritise is making sure that we continue to allow W sports and the experience of audiences and fans who go to W sport, that we continue to nurture that in a way that it doesn't feel like to be legitimised or to be, you know, financially viable or for any measures of success to make it look the way that it does in men's sport. And so that's something that I hope that we can hold on to.
Yeah, I think with W sport, with the W at least, I obviously love it. And I think that, and I love going to the games. I'd go to more games if I could, but the way that the fixture kind of rolls out means that it limits how many you can get to physically. And I think one of the big things about driving audiences to actually go to the games would be if it was really easy to work out when the season starts. I just feel like the women's game has been moved around so many times. People don't really know where it is, when it is, why it is, when it is. You know, there's the aspect of tradition and nostalgia could really be something that we operated from to try and fuel the number of people going through the turnstiles at W games, but they don't. And that hasn't been something that has been lent on. And if it has, it's been borrowed from the men's game. Like, for example, Carlton and Collingwood being the season opener. I mean, that just befuddles every new fan that I know, because in the W, that is not a traditional rivalry. I don't think that it will serve to be the best game. It will be the most televised game. It'll be on the main channel. It'll be prime time. I can think of a few other permutations that would have been a much better sell of where the game is currently at. But we're in the infancy of this competition. So I think that you're probably better to look at global sports like cricket, for example. When women's cricket is played in the MCG, it's not selling out unless Katy Perry's there. So they're the questions that I think a lot of people are digging into. And that's not to say that, men's games are all selling out, but there's definitely hype and tradition and hyperbole around how important they are. And I think that kind of feeds into that life or death moment that, it's sold to us. I think that the coaches have done a good job in the men's game at times of taking the heat out of it, of saying, well, this is actually just a game. We'll have next week as well. The season goes for, 27 weeks or whatever you play finals. It's important, but it's not as important. It's not life or death. We do this for fun. This is frivolous. This is a fun thing. This is meant to be, because I think they need, and I imagine that they're always saying that to take the heat off for their players, so that their players are not getting those DMs from people saying, I bet on you and now you've lost all my weekly earnings. So, I feel like there's this real amping up because of the competition that the broadcasters are feeling, or that the, membership drives, have to kind of amp up how important every single game is, because they want people to go through the gates so that they get the takings. And so, I think that, it was always capitalism, let's be honest. Like, I think that that's at the core of why that kind of amps up every time. And in terms of the W, they kind of throw their hands up in the air and say, well, it's a lost cause. It doesn't make money, as if that's the only metric, which I firmly don't believe that should be the metric that the W is being judged on in its 10th season over its 8th year. So I think we can learn a lot, but I think we're probably better to look to global sports like cricket and look at what the viewing habits and the attendance habits are of people to those games, because there is no reason why I can't think of a reason why people wouldn't be turning up to watch the Australian women's cricket team play, only that they are so dominant that it's kind of us and daylight at the moment. So, but I kind of think Australians would like that.
I think there's something in, to go and try something that you haven't tried before. If you're thinking about new audiences, you need to unpack the mystery of it and really make it easy for people. And, in the same way that, say, youth sports are often put on the other channels where you have to go and find them, they're often put in the other stadiums where you have to go and find them as well. And people don't necessarily have the experience of travelling to suburban grounds to go to sport. I'm hoping that that's something that starts to change, and you see it. I think Sydney has done an incredible job of Henson Park in the AFLW's become just, it looks like such a carnival. I would love to get to a game there, and in Adelaide as well. Like the attendance in games in Adelaide and some of those Sydney games is incredible. And I think, we can do things to kind of unpack the mystery of it and invite people in and think about, well, what are the barriers for people going to these games, and so what can we do to fix that? We're seeing crowds in US sports, in college sport, particularly in women's college basketball. Like the crowds are outstripping even some of the, I'm going to say the NBA games, and I'm got no data, but that's the feeling. But we're seeing just enormous attendance numbers there.
It's the lack of FOMO as well. I would love, like, Keeva, I would love you to deep dive, the power of FOMO, because one of the issues that the W has had, we're talking about our code of choice here when we talk about the AFLW, but, the broadcast side has always been the side that they've also let the punters in. They don't often open the grounds on the other side of the broadcast side. So you're shooting into an abyss of empty seats, right? So there's no one at home thinking that they're missing out on something, because firstly, there's no atmosphere because you're watching an empty stadium, even though you can hear the couple of thousand people that are sitting underneath the broadcast. But it also means that our highlights, the highlights of the game when you look back on them, are often in an empty stadium. So you see Courtney Hodder taking these unbelievable screamers in front of no one because that side of the ground wasn't open. So that's really been an own goal. But, you know, it also, in the scheme of things, shouldn't matter because when I watch, you know, nostalgic shows like The Front Bar and they show old footage of the men's game, they're playing those games in front of like 4 people sitting behind the goals. Like, you know, it's at the equivalent point. Well, it's not even at the equivalent point of time in the development of the code, but, you know, it was probably 30, 20 years ago and people weren't driven as much as they were to the games at that point. And maybe it's because now it's a national competition. So it's you know, there's more skin in the game. There's more Australian audiences watching it. So there's more people turning up. The professionalism of the sport back at that time, the men probably had jobs. They were still doing incredible feats of strength and the games were exciting and fantastic. And that's where we fell in love with the game. But, you know, I think it is kind of comparable to where the AFLW is sitting right now. And I think that's kind of okay. What I don't want to see is the mood in the outer of the W Games change because it is so family friendly, queer friendly. It's just it's a beautiful place to go. And the length of the games means that it's not tiring for people who might have other access issues or whatever it is. And I think all of those things really need to be constantly celebrated because it's really unique. It's really Australian and it is world first and it's extraordinary. And it's extraordinary to see the rate of change that has happened over the last 10 seasons.
Yeah, and I think ground selection is so important. I have been to Henson Park. I had a fantastic time. My husband came with me and he said it was amazing as well, you know, having a few beers and it just felt like football. Whereas sometimes when you go to the games at the bigger stadiums, it feels more like a spectacle than you know, the essence or the heartland of what football is or what I remember from my childhood. Fremantle Oval is still very much thriving and I've gone to an AFLW game there and it was fantastic. It took me right back to being young and just sitting on the outer and enjoying the sunshine and, you know, having a few beers. So I do think ground selection and the ability for people to get to it is really important and weather coverage as well. Like some of the grounds I see are just very exposed and I think that doesn't really suit anyone to sit out on a freezing cold day in you know, freezing cold kind of winds. Obviously, basketball has the advantage of weather control and, you know, stadiums. You actually want to be close in on a basketball game. You don't want to be too far away from it. So people do sit in nice and close, even in a game that's not particularly well attended. It looks well attended on, you know, the TV because everyone prefers to sit close in so they can kind of see it, taste it, feel it. It was amazing actually being in Chicago and going to Bulls games. My husband will hate me for saying that. He's a big Lakers fan. But, you know, the passion, and it would happen 3 times a week, you know. It was fully attended and the Bulls were not doing well. So this was like incredible to see just that kind of sense of crowd and spectacle and people getting out. But again, the stadium's really close in. So it's not that people have to travel. They can just kind of, you know, turn up. Yeah, I wanted to talk lastly, I guess, a little bit about the Outer Sanctum. Where did that start? It's, for those who are unfamiliar, the Outer Sanctum really does talk sport from a very diverse perspective. It's fun, it's light, it can be serious, but, you know, it certainly had a lot of joy to it. Tell me a little bit about that and what's its future? What's going to be happening with the Outer Sanctum?
Well, the Outer Sanctum started back in 2016, so back before everybody had a podcast. we like to think we were in the, well, not necessarily in the first wave. We're in the second wave. And the Outer Sanctum was a group of 6 originally that then became 10 women who came together to talk about sport and to talk about the sport that we loved, which is Australian rules football. Of course, other sports crept in. And we ended up talking about sport the way we wanted to talk about it. So invariably, it was funny, it was inclusive, and it focused a lot on issues of equity and human rights. But through that Trojan horse of sport, we were able to have conversations that we'd been having offline. So we'd been in a group chat talking about football, and it really just came about because we wanted to hear the conversations that we were having about sport. And you'll remember back in 2016, it was around the time that Adam Goodes was being booed relentlessly. And that was a moment that really challenged us all, that, it was just breaking our hearts. You could see that it was just such a terrible moment that was played out week in, week out. We all considered walking away from football at that point, and instead decided to, I'm not going to say lean in, we decided to just step in further and to try and create the conversations that we wanted to hear. We were just so lucky to grow our podcast with 4 extra members who joined. And so it was a group of 10 of us who talked about men's football and women's football for a number of years. And it is one of the greatest joys of my life. When I think about the people that inspire me, it's often the members of the Outer Sanctum, kind of like the Spice Girls, but everyone kind of had different areas of expertise.
But football dorks.
And it's a friendship that continues to this day. We came back and did a series of episodes last year that kind of broke away from the format. The format's changed over the years anyway. I don't know if you remember COVID, but COVID really threw some curveballs, and we really had to sort of change up the way that we did the podcast.
And the pleasure of it, I guess, is that something that maybe a conversation that we started now has been continued in a lot of ways by people who are graduates of Making the Call, which, Making the Call is a cutting that has come from the shrub of the Outer Sanctum. And in terms of what its future holds is that, I guess for the listeners, it probably feels like we've left you in the wilderness, but for the participants and for the members of the Sanctum, it is so alive and well, because our group chat is just, it's crazy. Really, it is ongoing. It is the pocket education every day. It is often incredibly inappropriate, but we get together for most cultural moments, whether it's the opening ceremony of a sporting event or most recently the Hottest 100, and 10 diverse opinions that we all share inevitably teach us something, make us laugh, make us think, and end up in a whole lot of gifts. And it is so thriving, even though it's not being broadcast at the moment. I don't think that it will ever fully go away. I think part of the Outer Sanctum and what it really means to us and what it means to maybe the listeners is that it will always exist because it's actually who we really are. I think for the first time in my professional life, I really felt like it challenged me, and it was the passion project I'd always been looking for in my life. And, there's a lot that actually speaks to that, because, for digital media and for social media, and it gets a bad rap for a lot of the right reasons. Podcasting, as you will find, Keeva, podcasting is the industrial revolution that I was waiting for my whole life, really. Being a media producer and having worked in TV and radio for the entirety of my life. It's what I studied at uni, and it's the only thing I've ever done, really, apart from a short stint at Baskin-Robbins. So to be able to broadcast our own thoughts and voices without the gatekeepers who really haven't changed over time, to be able to do it in a safe workplace and to be able to make a difference, to become advocates, to have a voice, to find an audience, to find people who really would have laid down in traffic for us and still have become such incredibly important people to us in terms of teaching us things, letting us in, taking us on their journeys. It's really changed our lives, and the 10 of us will forever be really bonded. I think we'll all be involved in the Sanctum in whatever way makes it comfortable for us. It became untenable. It's like doing a group project with 10 people when you all have other jobs and families. So after we did it for like 7 years or something, it was a lot, because it became it became everything, and we became the spokespeople for so many hot button issues. And at times it felt kind of unsafe. So it's really informed the way that Lucy and I try to support our graduates, making the call, but we rely on that pocket fam so much. When we catch up, it's a really tight bond, and it's really strange because there's something about it that when I listen to like Mel C talk about being a part of the Spice Girls, honestly, or Harry Styles talking about being part of One Direction, I go like, yeah, I've lived that.
Yeah.
And it's so weird because it's this stupid little tiny podcast that just blew our socks off for 7 years or whatever. And it, but felt like we were a part of something for a moment there. And even yesterday, like we still get emails from people who are like at the height of their career flying in these incredibly powerful industries, and they will email us and say, P.S. I've listened to every episode of the Outer Sanctum. Like it's a phenomenon, and it's amazing, and it's the gift that keeps on giving, and never say die. I mean, there's a real chance that we'll be back at some point because season 10 kind of can't go without us celebrating that. But it was never just about women's sport. It was about the community, and it was about belonging, and it was about voices from the outer, and that lives on.
And the great news is, being a podcast, anyone who hasn't listened to it yet, you can now kind of go all the way back and listen to it from the start. A couple of things I just want to pick up there just for our listeners. Booing in Australia is not a positive thing. Something I learnt working overseas, that booing is actually part of sports cultures in other parts around the world and is kind of considered normal as a part of cheering. You boo and you cheer. I had no idea of that and was quite horrified the first time I experienced it, because booing in Australia is considered a very strong statement of negativity, and it's certainly not something, most parents will tell their children, you don't boo, right? Like, it is something that is kind of frowned upon in Australia. And Adam Goodes was, of course, and remains one of the greatest who's ever played our game. And sadly, his career was cut short as a First Nations player because he was basically bullied out of the game as a result of this incessant booing. So I just wanted to kind of explain that, because it's something I was shocked by going to sports overseas, that booing is actually part of the cheering kind of culture, which, certainly not the case here. But I think, ladies, what you've created in, the Outer Sanctum, in making the call, this is stuff that shifts generations. I always think of Dr. Maya Angelou, you can't be what you can't see. I think we could extend that to the modern audience. You can't be what you can't hear. And certainly what you're doing is bringing these voices up, and diverse voices, not just of women, but non-binary, all different kinds of diversities. And it's an absolute honour and a pleasure to have you on Culture Snap, because really Culture Snap is very much about people shifting culture, and I hope you can reflect on the last 10 years and see how much culture you've shifted. And that is a legacy that will continue in all of the incredible people that have done your course.
Thanks, Keeva. That was very kind
It's
of
a bit
you.
nice. Thank you very much. That is really kind. It actually just feels like, obviously it feels like a privilege, and it feels like there's a lot more work to do. But I will say one thing about doing this work alongside your sister or sisters, because there was 3 of us on the Outer Sanctum, but, broadly the Sanctum is a sisterhood. It doesn't feel like you're really working when you are so seen and so supported. And I think that cultural shifts take a lot of emotional labour. And so for people who are listening to this, because they work at the intersection of shifting a culture in whatever it is, in your workplace or in your business or an industry, whatever it is, some great advice that we got was you kind of got to treat it like the tide. You push out and you push in. Like, you've got to take time for yourself. You can get really lost in the whitewash, and the defeats can feel massive and like huge blows, and you can wear them really hard. So, in doing this work, I'd say make sure you take time for yourself when you need to. And it's really important to make sure that your ride or dies are the people who are doing the work with you.
And don't ever pass up an opportunity to laugh.
Yeah.
I never do. And thank you both so much for being here.